Hello everyone, welcome back to Code to Serve Academy. Today we are going to start a new chapter, that is constructors. Okay, this is very important for your exam point of view. One question of 14 marks will be coming from this chapter. Okay, so let's get started with the topic of this chapter. So in the last lecture or in the last class, you have already learned about the functions. So what is functions? Why we declare function? What is the use of function? All these things we have covered in the previous lectures. Okay. In this lecture, we are going to learn about the constructor. So constructor is nothing but similar to a function. How we were declaring a function, similar to that, we declare constructor. But there is some difference. So in constructor, the name of the function, suppose you were declaring a function with whatever name you wanted in case of a function. But in case of a constructor, the name of that function should be exactly same as the name of the class. Okay, I'll show you an example over here. First, let's see. Like suppose this is a class student. So this is one class with the name student. So inside this, if we declare inside this, if you see one function is declared with the name public student. This is a function. And in this function, you see the name of this function is similar to the name of the class. So this type of function, we called it as a constructor. Okay, so you have to keep in mind there is few differences that will be covering up in the later section of this chapter. But for now, you have to understand like constructor is a type of a function with the same name as a class name. Okay, so here it is written a member function with the same name as its class name. It is very important to keep in mind. Okay, so you will say, what is the use? Like we already had a function. So what is the use of constructor? So for constructor, whenever we create an instance of this class, that is, whenever you create an object, the data member that you see, there is the member method, and these are the data member. Okay. So the data member here, you see that the private float marks, this is having a default value. So the default value for now, float will be 0. Now, if you want later on, when you create one object, you want to change the default value to some other value, suppose to 5 or 10 or to whatever number, that time the constructor plays an important role. During that time, whenever an object is created of this class, this constructor will be called first. And once this constructor is called, you see over here, roll number, this is there is no space over here, this is in continuation, roll number. Okay, this roll number is similar to this roll number. Okay, so you see roll number, initially it was 0. Even though it was 0, we are again reassigning it to 0. We can assign it to any number, suppose 5.0. Since it is an int, we can declare only the int value 5. Now suppose if you want to declare marks as 6.0 initial value. Okay, so you can do it inside the constructor. All right, now let's see next. Here you see the purpose of a constructor is to create an instance of the class. I already told you like how we create an instance of the class name, then the object name equals to new keyword, then again the class name. So whenever we call like this way, it invokes the constructor. Whenever we are calling like that way, it invokes, that means it is calling this portion. This part will get called whenever we are creating an object. Suppose you will say, what if in a class this portion is not present? Then which constructor part will be called? Suppose this portion is not present in the code, then what will happen? Then also there will be no issue. In that case, compiler will provide a default constructor. We'll be learning about what is parameterized constructor and non-parameterized constructor. Then we'll cover that part in depth. For now, you have to keep in mind, like even though it is not present, compiler will provide a default constructor. Okay. So let's move forward. So this is a syntax you have already covered. We already know, like when we were learning about the class and object in chapter number 2, then we have already covered the syntax, how we create an object. Okay. Next. declaring and defining a constructor. So you see over here, like here, there is one class, class X, and it is having a data member, one int I. All right. And another int j and k, and one public X, like the constructor in the case of a function we already know, like we already have learned, like the access specifier, like all those access specifier that we were declaring, like public, private, protected, these all also applies to the constructor. So if we declare public, that means we can create the instance outside of this class. Okay, so we'll see what I mean by this. But for now, you see it is public. That means it is accessible outside of this class. Okay, so here you see like the values, whatever I told you, like the values we are trying to assign with a default value or with any particular value. So you see here we are initializing with 0, 0 and 0 with whatever value you can initialize in the default constructor. This is the case of a default constructor. All right. So you have already known so far like how we can declare it, how we can write it. Now let's move forward. What I told you, like you can also declare private or protected. But if you declare private and protected, we cannot create an object. What I was telling you, if you declare it private or protected outside of this class, when you will be creating, suppose this is one class, and now you want to create an object. How you will do that? You will say, suppose this is outside of this class, you will say x obj is equals to new x. Now suppose this one I have made it private. Suppose now I have made it private. Now what will happen? Now if you try to access like this way, if you now you try to access like this way, this will throw an error. This will throw an error. Why? Because the private part you cannot access outside of that class. Okay, that is accessible only within the member of that class. If there is one more function, we'll see in the later slide, like you see, like this is another class. Now suppose this one I am writing in another class, class Y. Okay, and here there is public static void main, and inside this I'm trying to call this obj x. Okay, this class x. So this will throw an error. Why it will throw an error? Because private constructor we cannot access outside the non this class, outside this class. All right, so keep in mind, like whenever you want that object to be created, always you have to declare public. You cannot declare private. All right, so these things you have to keep in mind, what I was trying to explain you. So here you can also declare private, protected, but if you declare private or protected, you cannot create an object of that class. So that is a case. Okay, of the same class in a non-member function. What is a non-member function? That is outside of this class. Non-member function is outside of this class. That is what we were creating in class Y. If you want to create in, suppose there is another function, suppose there is public void, suppose a function is there call, and now suppose the scenario is this one is private, this one is private. Now the private constructor can be called from the member method. So this member method is a part of this class. So this class can access the private method. So this class can access the private method, but outside that class cannot access the private method. So here if you write, here you write x obj is equals to new x, this is totally valid. Why? Even though it is declared private, so the private constructor or the private member can be accessible inside the same member method. Means that is just inside that of class. If there is another member method, then that member method can access the private member. But outside of that class, it is not accessible. Got it? So this thing you have to keep in mind. If you declare it private, this won't be accessible outside that. That means you are not allowing to create an object. Okay. All right. So I hope this point is clear. Generally, a constructor should be defined under public, what I was mentioning you. If you declare it private, that means you are not allowing others to create an object of that class. That means generally, whenever you create a constructor, it should be declared with public. All right. So that the object can be created. That's what I was mentioning you. Like if you create it private, you cannot create an object. All right. Next, you see here, there is like what I was explaining you now, the same thing is declared over here, shown over here. This is a private X. This is a class X, and the constructor is there, and the constructor is having a private access specifier. So you see here is private X, and now there is another member method with check, and that check is able to access this private constructor. Whatever I am showing over here, this is valid. This is what? This is valid. But when I'm trying to access it from Y, what I was mentioning you, whenever I'm trying to create an object from Y, this becomes invalid. Why this becomes invalid? Because this is a private constructor, and outside that class, I'm not able to access the private constructor. All right. But within this class, if there is another member method, that is a check, that member method can access the private constructor. This is what I already explained you in the previous slide. You can pause the video and again you can take a note of it. Okay. Next. So I was telling you, like the constructor is pretty much similar to the functions, but there are some differences. So what are those? Let us have a look over here. So what is the purpose? Why do we create constructor? So constructor creates an instance, that is, we create an instance of a class. The purpose is to create an instance of the class. But what is the purpose of a method? Method we generally declare, method we generally create to group a number of statements. Suppose there is 5 statements. Suppose I have given you write a program to reverse a number. So to reverse a number, there is some set of statement that you will be writing. Suppose 10 statement you will be writing. Now you want to call it again and again. That means you can group it into a function and you can call it n number of times. So that is the use of a method. Method we generally use to group the statement. But constructor we use to create an instance of the class, that is the object of the class. Got it? Now the return type has no return type. What I was mentioning you, like the constructor there, if you see the syntax wherever we have written here, if you see it over here, private X. But if you see another method, it is void check. So void check, this is what? This is the return type. So in a method, we have to declare the return type. We have to declare the return type. But in constructor, we don't have to declare the return type. We cannot declare the return type. So you see only the access specifier and then the name, that is the name of the constructor similar to the class name, but there is no return type. So this is what you have to keep in mind, like has no return type, not even void. If function is not returning, if the constructor is not returning anything, then also we don't have to write void. But in case of a function, what we were writing, in case of a function, if that function is not returning anything, then we were writing void. Okay. But in this case, if the constructor is not returning anything, we don't have to write void also. Okay. But in case of a method, if the function is not returning anything, we have to write void. Okay. Or a specific return type. If that function is returning any integer value, then we have to write int. If it is returning any boolean value, then we have to write boolean. So whatever the return type will be there, we have to specify that. If there is no return from that function, we have to write void. But in case of constructor, if it is even though a constructor cannot return anything, that is why we do not declare anything. Okay, so we do not have to specify even a void also or any different type of data types. Okay, now next, the name. So what I mentioned is like the name should be similar to the class name. So the class name is X. So the name of the constructor should also be X. Okay, but in case of a method, it can be of any name. Whatever you want, you can specify it, but it should not be the same as the class name. So you have to keep in mind, like if you make it same as a class name, that will become a constructor. All right. Now the execution called at the time of creating an object. Like when we were creating an object like x obj is equals to new x. So whenever we are creating an object, that time it is calling the constructor. But when this function is called, whenever we require, suppose there is one function void check. All right. So there is one function void check. Suppose in program, whatever program you're writing, in line number 2, you need to call this check. So you can simply call check. Suppose in line number 100, you require this. So again, you can call it check. So it is like it is So it is called when we require. When in suppose in line number 2 we require this function, we call it. In line number 100 we require this function, we again call it. So method is called whenever we require it. But the object, that constructor, when it is called, whenever we create an object, that time it is called. All right. Next. So there is two types of constructor. One is parameterized constructor and one is non-parameterized constructor. This is also called as a default constructor. Okay, so you have to keep in mind, like there is two types of constructor. One is parameterized, one is non-parameterized. So parameterized constructor, if you see by the name, it suggests like the constructor will accept some argument or the parameter. Okay, so suppose there is one constructor xyz. You can assume this like it will accept some argument, like suppose int a comma int b. All right. So this constructor, suppose the name of the class is xyz. So the constructor name also will be xyz. And that constructor in the signature part, if it is accepting some argument, that is here it is accepting two argument, then this becomes a parameterized constructor. And in this case, it is not accepting any argument. That is, no argument is accepted. Then this becomes a non-parameterized constructor, that is a default constructor. So that is only written over here. Those constructor which can receive parameter as called parameterized constructor. But in case like in case of non-parameterized constructor, which cannot receive any parameter is called non-parameterized constructor. It is also called as a default constructor. Now suppose what I was mentioning you, like in a class, like suppose there is one class A, B, C. This is one class. Okay. Now you haven't declared any parameterized constructor, not even the default constructor or non-parameterized constructor. Now if you'll create an object of ABC, how you will do that? You will write ABC A is equals to new ABC. This is how you will create an object or the instance of this class. Even though the default constructor is not present in this case, compiler will pass a default constructor. That means compiler will do something like this. And whenever this object is created, it is going to call this part. It is going to execute this part. Even though this was not present, this is supplied by the compiler. So you have to keep in mind, even that class is not having the default constructor or the parameterized constructor, that compiler will generally supply that default constructor. Okay, so these things you have to keep in mind. All right. Okay, let's move next. You can see an example over here for the parameterized constructor. I already showed you, like there is a class XYZ and it is having the private variables one int I, and you see this is the constructor. This is a constructor. So in this constructor, you see XYZ, it is accepting two argument, one variable, another variable. And now what we are doing, we are trying to initialize. That is what I was telling you. This is a parameterized constructor. So in case of a default constructor, we were initializing with some default value like I is equals to 0 or I equals to 5. Now, what is the use of parameterized constructor? Whatever value we want to supply, whenever we create an object, that time whatever value we are supplying, that value will get initialized to the data members. Okay, that value will get initialized to the data member. So suppose whenever we create, now you take an example. This is the case of, suppose this is a class XYZ. Now you create one object of this class. How will you do that? You will say X, Y, Z. Suppose I name it XY is equals to new XYZ. Now, if I call this, it will call the default part. Even the default path is not there. So compiler will pass that, supply that default constructor. But now there is a parameterized constructor. This time we have to pass two values. One value will be an integer type and another value should be of float type. So we'll pass over here 5 and 6.0. So what will happen? Now, whenever we create an object of this class, now this is a case of a parameterized constructor. This value 5 will come over here in case of A, and this 6.0 will be coming to this place. So whenever we are calling like this, it will call this portion and this portion of the code will get executed. And what will happen? Now, initial value of I was 0. Since it is an integer value, so the value will be 0. And since this is a float, so the default value will be 0.0. Now what we are doing, whenever this part is getting executed, the A will get initialized to I. So what we are getting in A? We are getting 5. So this 5 will get initialized to I, and B, whatever we are getting in B, that is 6.0. So this 6.0 will get initialized to Z. So this will become 6.0. Got it? So whenever you are calling a parameterized part, whatever value you are passing, that value get initialized to the data members. All right. Next. So in case of a non-parameterized constructor, you see like a class A is present. Here, there is no default constructor or no non-parameterized constructor is present. Even though it is not present, so when we are creating an object of this class, A object 1 is equals to new A. So this is a case of a default constructor or non-parameterized constructor. Since there is no default constructor, compiler will supply that and this code will get executed. There will be no error. But suppose you write like this way, A05 is equals to new A and you pass 5. So this will throw an error. Why? Because there is no constructor matching with the parameter, like one parameter of integer type. It is not, no constructor is matching with any parameter which is having an integer type. So this will throw an error. This will throw an error, but this will not throw an error because this is the default constructor. So even though default constructor is not present, compiler will supply that default constructor. But in case of parameterized, if that is not present, it will throw an error. If it is not present, it will throw an error. Okay, so you have to keep in mind. Next. So now there is one important concept like this keyword, like I will explain you let me have a look. Okay, all right. So first have a look to this picture, then I will come back. Okay, so you see, like, suppose there is one class, and inside that class there is three member function. Member function, that means there is three method present inside that class. Suppose I give you an example, class ABC. So this is the class. Suppose one void, uh, like a single copy of the method is created. Okay. Now suppose you take an example, check one, void, check two, void, check three. Suppose three member functions are present. Okay. So what it is telling, whenever we create an instance, of this class, what is happening? Only once, only a single copy of the method. Suppose a function one, function two, or function three. That means only a single copy of this function will be created in the memory. That means when suppose we create five objects, we create ABC O1 is equals to new ABC. This is one object. Similarly, we create O2, O3, O4, O5. Suppose we create five objects. Even though we create five objects, only one copy, only a single copy of these method will be supplied to the object. That means in the memory, there is only one copy of that method. But but each member method, suppose this object is present, now there is one integer value, int a is equals to suppose 1. All right. Now in case of a data member, for object 1, you see, for object 1 there is one data member. Suppose there is one other data member with b. So there is two data member. Now you can see there is two data member. So for object one, a separate memory for the data member will be created. What I told you, for all the member method, there will be only one copy in the memory. That means for this object, one copy will be created. For this object, no new copy will be created. The same copy of the member method will be used. But in case of data members, this is the data member and this is the member function. So in case of a member function, only one copy will be created for all the object. But the data member int a and int b, there is two data member present for each object. For obj1, obj2, for obj3, for each object a separate copy of data member will be created in the memory. So you have to keep in mind, there is member function, single copy will be created, and for each object these value will be separately created in the memory. So you have to keep in mind. Now what is the use of this keyword? So you'll come to know, like suppose this object 2 wants to change the value of a. This object 2 wants to change the value of a, or this object 3 wants to change the value of a, and suppose this check 2 wants to change the value of b. So how will that member function know for which value? Suppose there is only one copy. I'm telling this member 3 to change the value of a from 1 to 3. So how it will know, how it is going to know, like for which object I'm telling it to change it. Like I'm telling it to change for 2, 3, or 4, or 5. So this was the problem initially. Like it was unknown, like which one is going to change the value, means for which object I am trying to change the value. So this keyword helps us to resolve this problem. Now whenever we are calling the constructor, it supplies this keyword. It pass an argument, this keyword. I will first let us have a look here. Whenever a member function is called, whenever we are calling a member function, it automatically pass an implicit argument that is the reference to this object that is invoking that function. That means, suppose obj1, suppose obj1, here what I was telling you, suppose this object 1 is calling this member function, then this will pass a reference to this object. It will pass a reference to this object, and the reference is stored by this keyword. So this means this, it is a keyword, and this is a phantom argument. You have to keep in mind, this is a phantom argument. We have to keep in mind one keyword. Now this is what is happening, like whenever you're calling the member function, it will store the reference to that object in the memory wherever it is created. Now, how it is resolving the problem? How it is resolving the problem? Uh, First have a look over here. This reference can be implicit or explicit. This is we have already covered. Now have a look over here. Like this is a constructor box and this is a parameterized constructor. Now you see, we are accepting like three arguments, 1, 2, and 3. All right. Now, this dot width means we are referring to the current object. That is, whichever object has called this constructor, it is referring to that object. Now, what I told you, like suppose we have int A and int B. So for this obj1, there is a separate copy of A and B. For obj2, there is a separate copy of A and B. For obj3, there is a separate copy of A and B. Now, later on, any function, this member function 1 or member function 2 or member function 3 is trying to change the value of A and B. This will be, this keyword helps, like this keyword is helping to resolve whether I am pointing to this or I am pointing to this or whether I am pointing to object 4. So this keyword is automatically passed. This keyword is automatically passed and it will refer to the object which has called that function. Suppose I am calling this member function 3. So implicitly, it will pass an argument with this keyword, and this keyword will point to the object that has called that function. So now the compiler is pretty much sure, like if I'm writing this, I'm writing this. This means suppose obj1 has called this constructor, then it will change the value of width for obj1. Suppose obj2 has called this constructor, now the width value will change for obj2. Suppose obj3 has called this, then the value of width will change for obj3. It will not get changed for obj4 or obj5. Got my point? So this keyword, this is explicitly we are calling it. And even though we are not writing this part here, it is automatically converted like this. This dot width is equals to W. Even though we don't declare this here, then also it will get converted like this way. It will refer to this dot width is equals to W. Okay, got my point? So this is the explicit and this is implicit. Automatically it is being done by the compiler. And if we want to write this keyword from RO, we can do it. Another big important is like you can think of, suppose there is one class data member is present with the same variable. Suppose here I rename it box double width double height and double depth. Now you see, there is data member present with the same. Suppose this is double, here it is width, then height and depth. So this is a part of the member method, that is a part of the class variable. Now you see, the data that we are receiving in the parameterized constructor is also having the same name. Here is also width, here is also width, here is also height, here is also height. Now if you write width is equals to width, width is equals to width. Now you see it will, how it will know like which variable you are trying to refer, whether you are trying to refer to this local one or whether you are trying to refer to this global one. So now here this keyword also plays an important role. Now if you will place this here in front of this variable, this will always refer to the global variable, that is a class variable. Now this word like we have written like width is now assigned to the class variable. Got my point? So there is two important use case of this, like using this we can resolve the same name, that is that we were facing an issue, like if the same name is present then we can resolve using this keyword. And also like this keyword also helps us to understand actually which we are referring to which object and which data member. Got my point? So these are the few use case of this keyword. Okay, this is very important. I explained you like there is a multiple copies of the data member for each object. For obj1 there is a separate copy, for obj2 there is a separate copy of the data member, but the member functions there is a single copy for all the object. Got my point? So these things you have to keep in mind. Now next, so this keyword only pertains to an instance method, what I told you, instance method, and not to a class method. So this is very important, you have to keep in mind this pertains to the instance method, not to the class method, and is an implicit argument. That means it is automatically being passed whenever we are calling any member method, we get this keyword. Okay, and is accessible inside any instance method. Inside any instance method we can use this keyword. Next, a temporary instance. What is temporary instance? So this is also very important question. It has been asked many times. What is temporary instance? An explicit calls to a constructor let's creates an temporary instance. So I'll show you an example first. Like have a look over here. Like this is one instance, sample s1 is equals to new sample we are calling, and this reference is stored in this object s1. Now there is another use case, like you don't want to store it, like the reference to this object was stored in the s1 object, but if you are not storing, see the left part is not present, that means we are creating a object that we are not storing in anywhere. Okay, so that is an anonymous object, we call it as an anonymous object. So this type of object, whenever we create an instance like this way where we are not storing the reference of that object, that basically is a temporary instance. That means what will happen, as soon as the execution ends, like suppose here the execution ends, it will not delete the reference, it will not delete the memory for this object. But in case of this, whenever the execution ends, it gets deleted from the memory. So what, suppose it acquires 2 MB in the memory space, so it will clear, the compiler will clear that memory whenever the execution of this statement ends. So you have to keep in mind temporary instance exists till when it is executing, after that it dies. That is, there is no reference, there is no existence of this after its execution. But here whatever the instance we had created for s1, after this line also this s1 exists, because like it is not an anonymous object, it is not an temporary instance. So that will it will exist, but this instance will die as soon as the execution ends. Okay, so these things you have to keep in mind. So you can pause it. The temporary instance are anonymous, I told you, anonymous, and that is they do not bear any name, we are not storing it or we are not keeping it for a later use. Okay, now next, constructor overloading. Like method overloading we have learned in case of a function, similar to that we have a constructor overloading. So what is constructor overloading? Suppose you have what I have already showed you, like let's have a look for the example first. If we have, okay, so we have the example. So for the constructor overloading, you see, first example, then I will explain you. So there is one class like cons overload. So here if you see, one constructor is present with the same name as a class name, that is cons overload, without any argument. So this becomes a default constructor or a non-parameterized constructor. In this case, if you see, there is one parameter we are receiving, but it is also having the same name. It is also having the same name. Like here, if you see, here you see like cons overload, cons overload, cons overload, cons overload. But the only difference is in the case of the signature. If you see the signature, here there is no parameter it is accepting. Here there is one argument. Here there is two argument. All right. So that means we are having the same name. We are having three constructor with the same name, but differs in the signature. So it is having one zero parameters or zero. Here it is having one argument. Here it is having two argument. So whenever you call it, suppose here when you call it cons overload object one is equals to new cons overload. So it will call the default constructor. It will call this one. So if you write only obj1 object one, so it will call this part. Now for this, it will call, now it will match the argument and the type of that argument. So the argument that we are passing is 3, and that 3 is of integer type. So it will match, it is matching this one. So it will call this portion. Now if you see, there is 3 argument being passed. Oh, here there was 3 argument. Okay. So now it will match the parameter. It is having the same name. It will go and look like which constructor it is pointing to. Now it will call this argument. So for object 1, the value will be 0, 0, 0. For object 2, whatever we are passing, that value will get initialized. For object 3, the value, whatever we are passing, that value will get initialized. So constructor overloading is nothing but having the same name, but there is a difference in the signature. That is the number of argument and the type of the argument. And whenever we call it, so basically that argument or that constructor gets called whatever value we are passing in the actual parameter. So this is the actual parameter. Suppose we are passing 3, so it will match to which parameter it is matching. So it is matching to this constructor. So only this part will get executed for object 2, and this will not get executed for object 2. But in case of object 3, only this part will get executed and the remaining 2 will not get executed. So I'm writing here, this is getting called for object 1, this is getting called for object 2, and this is getting called for object 3. Okay. So this is what is constructor overloading. Next. Now suppose you want to call, now suppose there is one constructor like cons overload, and inside this constructor you want to call this constructor. So what I mean, from one constructor you want to call another constructor. Suppose inside this I wanted to call this constructor. So what I can do is, suppose public cons overload int x. Now, inside this constructor, I want to call this constructor. How I can do that? We can achieve this by using this keyword. So if you write this, and you don't need to specify anything, directly you pass the type and the number of argument to which constructor you are calling. Suppose I want to call this. So this is having 3 argument and the type is int, and float. So if I pass it 5, 5 and 6.0, so this is matching to this. And basically whenever we are calling this constructor, then it will call this constructor. Got my point? So if you want to call another constructor from one constructor, then we can use this keyword and we can pass the type. So the type is int, and double. So if we write 5, 5, 6.0, now it will call this. So in case, suppose for this, we were calling this, and internally internally, suppose I have removed this part and I have replaced with this part. Now it will call this the third part also. So this is the use case. This is the use case what I have written over here. You can see this keyword we can write and we can pass the argument to whatever constructor we want to call. All right. Next, this is very important. This is very important. One question of 14 marks will be there in your board exam, similar to this type of question. Okay. So if you understand one question, it will be pretty much similar. Only the logic will be changing and the member method will be changing and the data members will be changing, and rest the question will be pretty much straightforward. And exactly this type of question will come and it will be of 14 marks. So it is very important to pay attention for this question. Okay. So you see over here, you have given design a class. Everything is given over here. You have been told to design a class with the name showroom. So you cannot declare your own class name. So you have to use same class name. Now what it is telling, declare a class name showroom and with the following description. Okay. So what is there? Okay, so what you have to do, like the instance variable or the data member is given, like you have to create a string name long, double, double discount and double amount. That means inside the class, whenever you declare a class, these five data member you have to create. So let's go on creating step by step, then I will come back. So we have been given five data members. One is name, mobile number, cost, discount, and amount. Okay. So first we'll declare one class show. So whatever is there, it was showroom, whatever case, whatever camel case, however it was written, you have to write exactly same. You cannot change it. Okay. So this was there. Next we had string name. So you have to declare one member, data member, that is a string name. Whatever was mentioned, first create that. Okay. Then the another data member was long mobile number. So you have to write long mobile number. Next, what was that? Double cost and double discount, and last was double amount. So you have to declare double cost, discount, and amount. Got it? So we have declared five data member. You see, the first portion is done. First portion is done. So you were told to declare an instance or the data member with these name. We have declared string name, long mobile number, cost, discount, and amount. Now the next portion is like it is telling you to create a constructor. You see over here, if you see the same name as the class name, that means it is telling you to create a constructor. Now, which type of constructor? It has already been specified, create a default constructor. It is telling you to create a default constructor to initialize a data member. So whatever data member you have declared, create a default constructor and initialize those data with the default value. So that is the use case of a default constructor. Okay. So what we will do, we'll declare one default constructor. Okay. uh so we'll declare show. So this is a default constructor. We are not accepting any argument, so this becomes a default constructor. And here we have to assign these values, these data, with a default value. So string, in case of a string, what is the default value? In case of a string, what is the default value? Empty string. And in case of long, in case of a long, we have to declare 0.0L. You can declare 0.0L, or also if you declare 0, that is also correct, or you can directly write it as 0L. 0L. L signifies like the 0 that we are telling to initialize to this belongs to the long type. So even though we declare L or we don't declare, it will be of long type. Okay. Next is cost. So cost is equals to 0D. You can write small d, or you can write like this 0L also and 0 capital L also. Or for this cost, you can write 0D or you can write 0D small d. So this signifies that this 0 is not of int type. This is of double type. So you can write like this also, or you can generally write 0. So I'm writing here 0D small. Next is discount is equals to 0D. Next is amount is equals to 0D. So see how easily we have covered the first two portions. You see over here, whatever we were told to create one default constructor, and we have to initialize the data member. These are the data member, and we have to initialize with the default value. So the default value of string is double quotation. For mobile number is 0L, that is, it is of long type, and similar to that, remaining one, we declared it similar to that. Okay. So come back over here. Okay, so this is of cost is of decimal type. Double is of decimal type. So we have to declare 0.0. This is of decimal type. So we have to declare decimal portion also 0.0. All right. Rest everything is okay. So first two portion we have completed. Now let's have a look to the next portion what we have. Next is void input. It is telling you to create one member method with the name input, and the return type of that method should be void. And in this case, you have to take input the customer name, mobile number, and the cost. You have to take three things as input in this method. So we are creating one method with void input. So I'm continuing over here again. Next. So we'll create one member method. So this is a continuation. So this is a continuation. Okay. So what we'll write? Void. What was the name? Void input. Okay. Void input. Okay. Whatever has been asked in the question, do like that way. Void input was given. I'll create void input. Now to take input, you have to take input using scanner. So in the starting of this class, you have to declare import Java dot. So in which package scanner is present? Java dot util dot scanner. Now to take input, you have to initialize the scanner object. So you'll write scanner sc is equals to new scanner, and in this you have to pass system dot in. Now you have been told to take name, mobile number, and the cost. So you will take first name. Name is equals to sc dot next line. So you have to read the line. So you'll write next. Okay. Next is mobile number. So MOB number. So you'll write sc dot next long. Okay. So now you have taken the mobile number. Next is cost. So you'll write. So you have to keep in mind what is the type. So this type was long, so I have to write next long. Now what is the type of this cost? Cost is equals to SC dot next double. Since it is of cost is of double type, so I have to write SC dot cost double. So now what I have done, I have taken all the input that was required. Okay, so if you come back over here, so we have completed, this part, we have completed this part, and we have also completed this part. Next part is void calculate. So what it is telling, you create another method with the name void calculate, and in this you have to calculate the discount on the cost price of the purchased item based on the following criteria, and the criteria is given in the next page. So this is the criteria. So if the cost is, this is cost. So if the cost is less than 10,000, then you will get a discount of 5%. If the cost is 10,000 and less than 20,000, then you will get 10%, and similar to this condition. Okay. So next what we have to write, we have to create another method with the name void calculate. All right. So let's create void calculate. All right. So what we have to check, we have to check whether the cost price that we have taken, okay, so that is less than 10,000. So then we'll get the discount of 5%. Okay. So here we'll write the condition. If so we have already taken the input of this cost price. So what we'll write, if the cost is less than or equal to 10,000. Again, let us check the condition. It is telling less than or equal to. Condition is given less than or equal to 10,000, then 5% discount. So what will happen? If my cost is less than or equal to 10,000, ones, tens, 100,000, 10,000. If the cost is less than or equal to 10,000, then the discount is equals to, what will be the discount? 5%. 5% of what? Cost price. So the cost into 0.05. That means it is a 5%. 5% means what? 5 divided by 100, that will be 0.05. So we have to multiply that cost by 0.05. That means whatever discount we will be getting, we'll get the discount. Then what will be the actual amount? Actual amount will be equal to cost minus discount. Got it? So this was the first scenario, if the cost was lying in this range. Now suppose uh, later on you can pause the video, or you can go back and have a look. Okay. All right. Now over here, now suppose this was the first case. Now the second case, you assume if the cost is greater than 10,000, it is greater, it is not inclusive, because it has already been included in this portion. If the cost is greater than 10,000 and cost is less than or equal to 20,000. So this was the case. If it is greater than 10,000 and it is less than or equal to 20,000. So you see over here, more than 10,000 or less than, or it means it is equal to, this part is included. Okay. Less than or equal to 20,000. Here you think of it is included. All right. So what will happen? In this case, Okay, let's move here. So in this case, what is happening? The discount is equals to cost into 0.10. That is a 10%. Okay. All right. Now the discount amount will be cost minus discount. Got it? Now we have completed the two portion. Now what it is telling, the third case is telling, like, if the amount is greater than 20,000 and less than equal to 35, we have to write two more cases. So if it is greater than, if the cost, if cost is greater than 20,000 and cost is less than or equal to 35,000. This was the case, greater than and less than equal to 35,000. Then the discount will be equal to cost into 0.15, and the amount will be cost minus discount. See, whatever logic we are writing, you could have also written the amount is equals to cost minus discount at the later part. That means you won't have to write again and again and again. This way also you can do. And if you want to write it in every go, that is also okay. Next, what is the third case? If cost is greater than 35,000, then the discount is 20%. I think 20%. Cost into, okay, this is 35,000. Okay, so cost into 0.2 and amount is equals to cost minus discount. All right. So this portion is completed. This is the closing of this part. That means we have completed this criteria. We have calculated whatever stuff we required to calculate. Now the next part is display void. So for display void, to display the customer name, whatever we have to display, name, mobile number, amount to be paid after the discount. So you have to display three things: name, mobile number, and the amount. And what is the name of the function? It is a display. So you'll create another function, that is void display, and inside this you will display what is the name. So name we have assigned into the name variable, so we'll write over here name. Similar to this, second part, what we have to show, mobile number. And the third part is the final amount. So what you will write, is equals to amount. So this part is also complete. Now we'll be closing the class. So this is the closing of the class. Whatever class we have started, so this part is the closing of this class. So you see, whatever we were required, so this portion we have created, this all the things we have created, this display void is also created. Now only one part is left. If you check over here, it will say now write a criteria to create an object. Now you have to create an object also. So of the above member method. So what you will do? You will create another class. You can do it in another class. See, you can do it in another class also, or in the same class, you can write the main method. You can write public static. You can do in the same class also, or you can do in a separate class also. Public static void main string args. Okay. Now what you have to do? You have to create the object of this class. So how you are creating the object? Similar to that, you have to create an object that is a showroom SR is equals to new showroom. So this will call the default constructor, that default constructor we have created in the initially. Okay. Now you have to keep in mind, like we were having one function that is input. So you have to check, like you were having one function that was the input. So first it's our responsibility to call this. So that is when user will give an input. Then after calling this input, we'll call the calculate, and after calculate we'll call display. Okay. So we'll call it first, we'll call it like sr dot input. So whenever we'll call this after creating the object, it will ask user to give the name, mobile number, and the cost. Next, when we call this, everything get initialized to the value, whatever data member we have created, those value will get added over there. Then we will write sr dot calculate. So this method that we created, calculate method we created, based on the cost, it will calculate the discount and the final amount. Now after calling this, we have the final amount. At the end, we will call sr dot display. Now it will display the name, mobile number, and the actual amount to be paid. So this is the closing of this main, and this is the closing of the class. So this is the complete program. Similar to this, only the data member or the type that we saw over here, like the amount is between this range. So this portion will only get changed, and rest of the logic, how you create the member method, how you create the constructor. In some questions, there are written like create a parameterized constructor. So here we have created a default constructor. In your exam, there might be a question of parameterized constructor, and at the end you have to create or call the object, and accordingly you have to display it. So if you have any question, do comment it. I will try to answer all your doubt. Okay, till then, bye and take care.